Assalamu alaikum and shalom alaikum, Rabbi Michael Beals. We are fortunate to have with us a very distinguished person of faith from the state of Delaware, Rabbi Michael Beals, who is the rabbi of the synagogue in Wilmington, Beth Shalom. He is also the chairman of the Governor's Council on Faith-Based Partnership. He has been an important voice on interfaith issues, on issues of social justice, on issues of politics. Anything that matters, Michael Beals' voice is important to that, at least in the state of Delaware. And over the years, I've had a great opportunity to work with the rabbi, and I have learned from him significantly. So today, we are going to talk about Jewish teachings, about plagues, pandemics, and also learn from the rabbi what can Jewish scriptures and Jewish tradition teach us about understanding the coronavirus pandemic and also coping with it. So without much ado, Rabbi Beals, can you share with us what Jewish scriptures and Jewish traditions and Jewish faith tell us about plagues?
Well, your timing is impeccable, and I have to thank you. I have to say, really, shukran, and thank you so much for including me as such an honored guest to share with you. I'm humbled. I don't think I'm anywhere near as clever as the other people you had, but I will do my best. So first of all, your timing, like good comedy.
You are modest like Moses,
Rabbi. So I have to thank you. Your timing is so impeccable, Professor Khan, because we find ourselves right now in the middle of Pesach, or the celebration of Passover. A few days ago, we had the Seder to begin our Passover celebration, and our holy day continues for 8 days, of which we're right in the middle. And today corresponds, I don't know when people will listen, but today is Easter Sunday, which is also one of the days of Passover. So we're all coming together, and Ramadan is right around the corner. So there's like this beautiful interfaith bridge. So you're asking me about plagues during Passover. You're brilliant. So I will say to you that when we think about plagues in Judah, we think about the 10 plagues which God visited upon Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And it's interesting when we read about these plagues, at the Seder, we actually have a glass of wine. And if you're allergic to wine, or if you were my guest, as a Muslim, I give you grape juice. But we take out, in Judah, the wine represents joy. We take out 10 drops every time we mention one of the plagues in Hebrew, and then perhaps in English as well, to say that our joy is diminished when other people suffer. So the question, why did these plagues happen? And so there's several biblical reasons given. One is that the pshat, or the surface meaning, is because God wanted to change Pharaoh's mind to let the children of Israel go. And every time Pharaoh said no, there was another plague visited. So that's the superficial level. But if you dig a little deeper, you have to consider who are the audiences. So one of the audiences were the other Egyptians, right? And they believed in this pantheistic system that believed in all sorts of gods. The god of the river, the Nile itself, the god of the sun, Ra, etc. And so there was, if you will, a quid pro quo for each. Oh, that's a very political phrase, isn't it? Quid pro quo. Right?
Yes.
Never mind. Of the gods of Egypt, there was a plague to respond to each of those gods, to diminish those gods in favor of one omnipresent, omnipotent, one God that was above them all, something that Muslims and Christians and Jews share in common. So if you will, God was not just the God of the Israelites, God cared as much about what the Egyptians were thinking as well. I find very, very interesting that already in the book of Exodus, we have this idea of a God who is in many ways universal, and if you will, multicultural and interfaith, and cares more than just about the Jews, as opposed to a tribal Jewish God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. This God cares about other people too. The other thing that's interesting is that these plagues may have been for the Israelites themselves, who've been slaves for 400 years, to give them a lesson in theology as well, that there's a God above them all. You see, that reason will be very different than the reason about trying to get Pharaoh to change his mind. That in a way, it's irrelevant if Pharaoh changes his mind at all. It's really about trying to teach the people theology. And I find that very interesting. So that is just a beginning to an answer to your question. But I rather converse with you more. So push me a little further and I'll answer.
Well, well, I think you have already blown my mind away. This story of the plagues is also in the Quran. So at least 5 or 6 plagues are mentioned for essentially Pharaoh's refusal to listen to Moses and to free the Hebrew people and others, but essentially to acknowledge one God. The Quran is very clear because of Pharaoh and his followers. But I didn't realize that basically, if you imagine those 10 different deities of early Egyptians as like playing the 9 pins, and so God basically sent one plague to knock off each deity. Now that is something that is, I had never thought of it that way. But having said that, as a Muslim, every chapter except one in the Quran starts with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. God is most merciful, God is most benevolent, God is more forgiving. So many of his names and attributes are about forgiveness. But this business of plagues that kills so many people, makes so many people innocent or otherwise suffer for sometimes for years and years, it kind of it projects a very tough and cruel image of God, and to me that is very difficult to. I mean, how do we come to terms with this idea that God is merciful, but He can visit? I mean, you were using a very euphemistic term like God visited them with plagues. I would have said He unleashed hailstorms and locusts and blood and frogs on these poor people.
So I can answer you a little bit by saying that when we consider Judaism, we believe in, if you will, 2 Torahs. The Torah B'dichtiv, the written Torah that you know, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But we also believe in an oral Torah as well, an oral tradition, which is encapsulated in our Mishnah, in our Midrashim, in the conversation that lead to the Talmud. This is all post-scriptural, so post Second Chronicles. If we were Jews that were locked only in the Bible, we would be Karaites. Karaites is a sect of Judaism that stopped before the rabbinic period. But I'm a rabbinic Jew, and the Jews that you speak to, Professor Khan, on campus at the University of Delaware, are all rabbinic Jews, which means that we believe our tradition continues. So one of the Midrashim, one of the oral parts of the oral law, says that after the sea opened, right, and the children of Israel parted through, which is also in the Quran too, and then the waters came and destroyed Pharaoh's army that was pursuing the Israelites. The Midrash says that the angels on high began to sing, and God stopped them from singing and said, "How can you sing when my creation lies at the bottom of the sea?" And that is a powerful Midrash to say that to pigeonhole God as just this vengeful, punishing God is to totally misrepresent God, that God is complicated. And doesn't that make sense? That how could we believe in a simplistic God that's only a punishing or angry God? That just like you, Professor Khan, and just like me, we can have multiple emotions and feelings at the same time. So why would we deny God the same? So I think it's simplistic and insulting to think of God as just as an angry, punishing, vengeful God or myopic God, that as the rabbis begin to hint in the Midrashim, God has multiple faces and multiple emotions. And that's what makes God so rich and worthy of worship.
You know, when my kids were younger, I would try to discipline them by taking away their video games or their access to some certain kind of a toy. And I would say, okay, because you did this, you cannot play with your video game for 3 days or 4 days. But I realized that in punishing them, I was punishing myself. I would feel the pain as much, if not more. So I never, ever completed the punishment. And my wife would say, don't ever say these things because you never complete it. With 10 minutes later, you say it's okay. And so the kids are not really taking you seriously. But I understand that if God really loved all of his creation, he would also hurt when they hurt. some of the religious scholars of nearly every community and every faith have been using the coronavirus crisis to push their own religious agenda. And they're trying to say that this is a pandemic that has been sent to punish these people and that people, etc. Maybe we all are not pious enough, religious enough. So while we can understand God's intention from plagues and other such catastrophes which are mentioned in scriptures because they are explained, how do we understand plagues and pandemics today that are happening? Is it the same kind of understanding? Is God sending coronavirus to earth because we are all like Egyptians were at the time of Musa? So
that's a $60 million question, isn't it? That we want to make jumps from the Bible or Quran or New Testament, and we want to impose those understandings on modern experiences. We want to do that to make sense and to make meaning in suffering. And I totally appreciate the desire to find meaning in suffering. The idea of taking somebody's unique theology and perspective and imposing it upon God is blasphemy and idolatry. To say that you, I, a human being, know the will of God is so repugnant to me as to make me nauseous. And it certainly makes me want to reject that. So what can we derive from the coronavirus? I would say this. First, I will refer a book to you and to your audience. It's called When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Harold Kushner. The most useful book on theology. Now, everybody tends to mistranslate it as why bad things happen to good people. And the reason why they get the first word wrong is because they want an answer to that question, and Rabbi Kushner will never give it. So in answering your question, I can't say that I find God in the coronavirus plague, if you will, but I find God in the godly human responses to the plague. So every time you see people going beyond their own comfort level and reaching out to other people to help them during this epidemic, and you could start by saying everybody that stocks your shelves in your grocery stores, which are somebody overlooked, and people still delivering your mail, and the people who are working to kind of find a scientific response to this, to create a vaccine, and all those dear people putting themselves at risk in hospitals, all those people is where you find God. It's in the response to the plague, it's not in the plague itself. And that I could say with assuredness. Now, that all said, theological people, especially in the Jewish faith, will take pause with something so awful as this pandemic and begin to question and say, well, given that this plague has happened, what can we do better? How can we be better people? So there's a little hint of Deuteronomic theology, right? Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah, says bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. I believe that Dr. Reverend Jones made reference to the same theology. I was listening carefully. I find Deuteronomic theology to be very frustrating when I'm trying to help people, especially in hospitals and all, because I'm trying to make them feel better and lift them up. And if they're blaming themselves why they have this illness in the first place, it makes my job doubly difficult to do. I would say we do not know why bad things happen to good people. All we can do is to try to be the good person when those bad things happen, to try to lift them up from their misery and suffering and give them hope. Because where the soul and the brain go, the body will follow.
You know, I also believe that the same logic applies to bad things happening to bad people as bad things happening to good people. Because at least from the Islamic perspective, the punishment, whatever the God is going to give, or forgiveness, is going to be after judgment. And so it's like me grading you in between, even before the exam is over. I also think that that because we don't get prophets anymore, at least Muslims and I think Jews also believe that there are no more prophets coming. So there is no clarification from God whether this particular pandemic is a punishment for something specific. I mean, God could be punishing the world for the kind of politics we have, or because we are not redistributing well. So who knows?
Professor, when you have people that say the coronavirus happened because of this reason, you
Yes,
need to say, I smell a fraud. I
I
smell
agree.
a
I
snake
agree totally.
salesman.
Yeah, so to my argument is that nature of biblical plagues that God used to visit ended with prophets.
Right.
So now we cannot draw direct correlation between plagues and some human condition or some divine purpose or cause for it. What we could argue is, yes, the environment is suffering, which is like a plague, and that is a direct cause of the way we are treating the earth. And so rather than suffering it, we can start working towards improving upon it.
Okay, so I want to run there because I think that's really good. So in the Torah, which I'm sure is embraced by the Quran as well, the three protected groups, which are evangelical ministers try to remember but failed to remember in that moment, the professor, and that is the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. I call that the original Trinity. Before the Christian came up with their Trinity, with the three-faced God and all that. Okay, I believe the widow, the orphan, and the stranger was the original Trinity. They're mentioned about 36 times at least in the Bible, in the Torah. And these are the people that are the most vulnerable. And God says rightly, I will hold you, the entire society, accountable for how do you treat those three vulnerable classes who don't have a parent to protect them, who don't have a spouse to protect them, and don't have a country to protect them. How will you treat them who are so vulnerable? And one of the things that's driven me mad in this coronavirus, at least in the United States, has been how extra vulnerable people of color have been, people who live in urban settings have been, people who don't have the ability to say, oh, I'll rent out my apartment in New York City and go take an apartment in the Berkshires where I can hold out for the next 2 months. I'm glad for those people who can afford to do it. But you know, there was a time in the Jewish tradition in New York City in the 40s where all the children went up to the Catskills in the summertime. You didn't have to be rich. Everybody went to it was hot and miserable. I've been watching The Amazing Miss Maisel.
Exactly. I have seen that show too. Yeah.
They were upper middle class West Side Jews, but they were not the only ones going up to the Catskills. I assure you, I also wouldn't have gotten a laugh with very plain poor people that were going up there. Everybody went away so that people didn't suffer as much. Today, the disparity between rich and poor in this country is so upsetting that not only in our social level can you get out or not, in New York City being an interesting place to look at that, but also the fact who gets care, who gets those tests for coronavirus, and who gets care. And for all those people who are of white privilege, who are shaking in their homes with this coronavirus, to be honest with you, they're the least likely to get it compared to people of color. They want to look at the odds. And I find that reprehensible. That's not the type of society that we learned about in the Quran or the Torah. We have such a long, England, if you will. Prince Charles got it, and Boris Johnson got it. Like, who knew that such a stratified society as England, who gave us Downton Abbey, that the coronavirus, if in some ways it argues that if the mightiest in the land can get it as well as the poorest, then I'm rather interested in that type of society. And so I'm not arguing for one politics over another or one candidate or another, but I'm saying when we're done, we're on the other side of this, not only should we look like how do we stockpile and how do we fund the CDC so that the pandemic group that was underfunded before this crisis happened, I won't say who did it, you can figure it out because I've been listening to you, but it seems to me besides those very practical things, we have to also look at what type of society do we have. If the healthcare system that we have now is clearly broken, if certain people can get help and other people can't in a time of crisis. That's where I think we'll be judged as a society afterwards. So,
if you remember that we had a similar episode in New Orleans when I'm forgetting what when the levees were broken and the water came in. And people suddenly realized as to how the extent of poverty that was in America, and we hadn't expected. And I think that if you look at, say, for example, Louisiana, I think nearly 70% of those who are dying are African Americans. So there is a clearly disproportionate impact of coronavirus, partly because there is this unfair access to healthcare, plus people have to work, some people can afford not to work, etc. I want to come back to you as someone who's ministering a flock of people and your synagogue. So what are you doing in order to ensure that all these protocols of staying at home and, you know, not questioning certain measures? You can see across the world, I see that religious people, rather than helping out, are also becoming a problem, an additional problem that we have to deal with, insisting on going to churches and mosques and temples, etc., and making it difficult for the government to handle COVID plus. So how are you dealing with your community, and what are you guys doing to cope with the crisis?
That's a great question. So first of all, Jewish people by nature are very communal people. We need a quorum of 10 Jews in Orthodoxy, 10 Jewish adult males. I'm in the middle of the different streams of the conservative, not politically so as you probably gathered, but in terms of trying to conserve the tradition. So I equally count men and women, Jewish adults, for the 10. But we need a quorum to call to worship. We need a quorum, more importantly, to say our Kaddish. My father died less than a year ago. I have an obligation for 11 months to say the mourner's Kaddish. I need 9 other Jewish adults to say it. What to do? Well, if I brought Jews together as a group to do it, even at that 10, which is the minimum number, right? And it is still, it's COVID-19, I'm still putting people in danger. In Judaism, we have a philosophy that's higher than all the other ones called pekuach nefesh, which means saving a life. That if you save one life, you have this in the Quran, we have, in the Torah we have it too. You save one life, it's like you've saved an entire universe. And I guess the same is true if you kill one person. It's like you destroyed an entire universe. How dare anybody practice their faith tradition and put people at physical harm? So the very first thing, as soon as the protocols came out, our synagogue was way in the front line. I think we were in front of the governor, who's been great on this, Governor Carney, who I love, but we were even in front of him, and we stopped. We stopped services at our synagogue immediately, but we started doing live streaming first. And by doing live streaming, I stood in my synagogue by myself, and I couldn't see anybody. I just had a little camera, and I looked up at it, and I did services until people began to feel that that this wasn't sustainable. And so we went over to Zoom platform, and now we look like either the Hollywood Squares or the Brady Bunch. And of course, your youngsters won't understand their reference. They won't understand Paul Lind in the center. They won't understand Alice in the center. But people my age, and perhaps Professor Khan, your age, will understand the cultural reference. But I have to tell you, it's been lovely. And we did something called a takana, if you will, a innovation in Jewish law, to say for now, not forever, but for now, we will count virtually 10 people listening together to hear the Kaddish. And I have to tell you something extraordinary. Since we've gone to live stream and Zoom, the amount of people we have for daily morning worship has at least doubled, and Sabbath worship has doubled. That you could say, if you're a cynic, well, they don't have anything else to do, all right. Yeah. But the other fact is that they could have done something else. They could be paying their bills, or they
could be on Netflix.
Yes, they could be catching up on Mrs. Maisel. But the fact that they join me in ritual and prayer is very powerful. So my job, and my cantor is my spiritual partner, her job has been to try to produce really beautiful services through Zoom that are meaningful and heartfelt. And we've used our technology to go ahead, as we're using our technology for you and I speaking. We're more than 6 feet apart, as I know, although my heart is right with yours. I mean, I couldn't be any closer to you. I'm giving you a virtual hug right now. There you are.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Not making you sick. The idea of following my religious tradition and making you sick, it sickens me. That's not the way to practice. That I will say that with a lot of things I hedge what I'm saying. I'm very culturally sensitive. This one I'll say, the first thing for a doctor practices is do no harm. I think the same thing must be for a religious leader. Do no harm. So we've used technology to stuff.
You know, there is a very beautiful hadith, La darar wa la darar, do no harm and do not even respond to harm. I just thought of a good line for Zoom. Business is Zooming, you know, especially for God and people of God. Do you think that moments like this let's say that there are those who are committed believers, those who are agnostic and reject the idea of a divine deity. It's fine. But then there are those who are like in the middle, like what do you call independent voters who need to be swayed. So do you think that moments like this pandemic and global crisis, etc., forces a lot of people to turn towards God? That's why you are seeing more people in your prayers and worships. Is it
Yeah,
fear of something?
yes, but not just that, but also I think people need each other. I think that there was a time when we were really, really tight communities. And I understand there's a book called Bowling Alone or something where,
Yeah. Robert Putnam wrote that, I think.
yes, and I think that now I warned you before we got on the air that I'm a guy when I see lemons, I like to make lemonade, or I could be cruder and say in a room that's filled with dung, I look for the horse. So I'm a very positive individual, and I am sorry that uh, this COVID-19 pandemic hit. I actually have a cousin in Leeds right now in England. It's the first time that a family member of mine, he's 91, God bless his soul, and he fell in his home, and my younger cousin, his son-in-law, went to look in on him, and it turned out he had this COVID-19, brought him to the hospital, and where, please God, he should make a recovery, I hope. But meanwhile, my cousin has to be in isolation from his wife, my blood cousin, and his daughter, because he now may have been, he was exposed, he might be carrying it himself. That's suffering. I would never wish on anybody. But the Jewish response to suffering is to try to find meaning and try to make sure you improve the situation and make sure that when we're on the other side, we're in a better place than we were before.
I did some homework, and I went and read an interesting article called "The 10 Plagues" by Rabbi Jill Jacobs. And yeah, I think she's pretty much on the left, but she made some interesting observations. She said that some modern Jews are troubled. She said something very interesting. She said that some modern rabbis today are also talking about political problems as epidemics and pandemics, such as ill treatment of immigrants, so that touches upon the stranger, putting children in cages, etc. So she was trying to say that these are also plagues that have been visited upon us. But she also made an interesting observation that some modern rabbis and modern Jews are questioning this idea of collective punishment as to why are people being punished during that, all those 10 plagues also killed and punished a lot of innocent people. So I was wondering that she was saying that why would God punish innocent Egyptians for the decisions made by the Pharaoh and his advisors, right? Why punish people for the decision? And I was wondering whether that would also prompt some people during the Passover season to reflect upon the collective punishment that Palestinians sometimes suffer in Gaza and other places because of the decisions that their leaders make, right? Children, why should the children be suffering from an endless blockade, etc.? So do these political reflections also come into discussions when they are discussing the plagues during the Passover?
So I think this year is different than other years. I think in past years, it'd be easier to have those political conversations. I think right now we're in such an existential angst that I have to deal with people's fears where they are right now. I think a useful religion takes people where they are and then brings them somewhere. So to be going into political, not just in Israel, Palestine, but all throughout the world, there are people who are collectively in this state. Why go to the Middle East, start in the United States?
Yes.
Why is it that groups of people have to suffer because of their economic positions, etc.? I would say this for the Jews in particular. This is not the Egyptian plagues was not the last time that we did a do-si-do with plagues. In Europe in the 14th century, the Black Plague, and in that plague, Jews were often blamed for these plagues. And they said the Jews were poisoning the wells. Well, first of all, Jews suffered from the same plague that the Christian neighbors suffered from as well. Jews may have suffered from it less because I promised you I'd bring it up somewhere, but we've had a hand washing tradition that
Yeah.
goes all the way back before pandemics. In the temple period, there's actually something called a laver, where the Kohanim used to wash their hands ritually before doing the sacrifices. And then after the destruction of the temple, before we eat bread, before we eat any meal, we have to ritually wash our hands. And in the Seder, we actually wash twice. Once without blessing in order to wash away things that we can't see. That they meant rabbinic, we thought we meant spiritual impurity, but now I think we can mean germs. And then we make another blessing before we eat the matzah. We wash our hands with a blessing. With all this hand washing and the fact that Jews practiced going to the ritual bath with the mikvah, and the men and women were separate from each other during a woman's menstrual cycle for 14 days. And if you look at all the religious practices we did, Jewish ritual practice throughout the years actually probably kept us safer during these times. Statistically so, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the Christian neighbors would have realized it one way or the other. But Jews were scapegoated for these plagues that even today, there are people on the kind of that white fringe that who are blaming Jews for these plagues that have happened. So it's still there, believe it or not, Professor Khan. So that makes me hypersensitive to how do we treat the minority? How do we treat those people south of the border? We are trained genetically and historically to be hypersensitive to all those that are victimized. That would include Palestinians as well. Although I dare say Palestinians is also how to put things out in kites that go over with fire and create terror on the other side of the border as well. But since you brought up the Palestinians, I will say that I'm most hopeful at this time because Israelis and Palestinians have never worked more closely together with a common enemy, this coronavirus. The amount of participation of Palestinian workers within the state of Israel, with nurses and doctors on both sides of the border almost doesn't even matter right now, but people are working on both sides trying to keep people safe and healthy. Because if you're in a boat, there's a hole under your seat. We teach in Hasidic thought that everybody drowns in the boat, not just the guy who had the hole under his chair. So I am hoping that these newly found practices of cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians will be so profoundly impressive that when this coronavirus, please God, is behind them, that they will build on a tradition of working together and create a united society that will really work well for both of them, so that the political questions you ask won't be able to be asked because they'll be non-existent. Say Amen, and I'll say Amen too.
Amen, inshallah. I have a question about this council that you are president of, that the governor has appointed for interfaith partnership, right? So faith-based partnerships. So has the Delaware government reached out to the faith-based partners in this moment of crisis?
Yes, God bless you for asking. So I have to tell you, I hope I don't get myself into trouble here, that up until now, I've been rather frustrated that we have this beautiful council created actually by Governor Michael, and was rather underutilized until now. And as I said before, with lemons comes lemonade. So Governor Carney has been so impressive. He's reached out to our faith-based partnership, and he said to me that his major concern are seniors. He's worried about seniors for two reasons, or perhaps three. One is, of course, they are vulnerable in general, but they're particularly vulnerable with this virus. And he's worried that if they all get sick at once, our medical, our hospitals will not be able to deal with it, and the whole thing will collapse. So he said, we must focus on the seniors. So he asked each house of worship, no matter what the creed, the faith, is to really hyper-focus on the seniors and to go ahead and create systems where every week, not just on one-off, but every week that the younger and more healthy will be reaching out to the older and more vulnerable with phone calls and checking in. That's step one. And then step two, the lieutenant governor, God bless her, and I know you've interviewed her as well. She's the daughter of a minister. She adores faith-based partnerships. That's like her middle name. She said she had no idea we existed, and now she wants to utilize us. So she helped put together with her staff a toolkit. Because it's one thing to call seniors, but if you don't know exactly how to handle the phone call, if you have imperfect practices, in some churches, maybe they're doing a great job, and in some, synagogue, maybe they're not doing, I'm sure all the mosques are doing a great job. But instead, she said, let's come up with a standardized level of perfection when it comes to asking those questions. And most importantly, so that the questioner will have a list, a toolkit of responses. So depending on what the person says they need, that the person could look down their list and say, you need to call this person, or we can get groceries in there for you, or we can go ahead and deliver things to your doorstep, etc. So this is an ongoing process of creating true faith-based partnership, not to force faith down the throats of any Delawarean, but on the contrary, but to use these houses of worship as sociological, organizational arms of the government where the government can't reach, to improve the welfare of every Delawarean using faith-based people who might be willing to go beyond their own comfort level because something greater than themselves inspires them to be better people.
So in a sense, you have authority from Caesar and you have authority from Christ. So from that position of authority, can you suggest two things that every faith leader in Delaware should do? Two things they must do in order to ensure that we come out strong, healthy, and safe out of this corona crisis?
Yeah, I'm sure there's more than two, but the two that come to mind is community and personal. Community, I think that our religious leaders should be trying to create the strongest communities possible right now, especially as communities have weakened. We need to use this Zoom technology and live stream, whatever we can, to create communities of caring and love and support, particularly to use the strength of the community to protect those that are most vulnerable in our community, and to really start to redefine community in a way that we've done before. So building strong communities is one. And the second thing that I think faith leaders must do is try to rekindle hope and encouragement and optimism, to put light in dark places and to lift people up. This 24/7 coverage of coronavirus and deaths, etc., can really take people's spirits and lower them, and to the point of depression and despondency and melancholy. And I think religious leaders, inspired by God as they call God, need to raise people up and give them not false hope, but real hope and real encouragement. And I spend probably most of my day and energy not only maintaining my own flame, my own fire inside of my own soul, but to try to spread that light, which is why I'm so excited you asked me to speak here today. If I can encourage even one person by my attitude and affect and voice and words to give them hope, as I said earlier, where the soul goes and where the mind goes, the body will follow. We work together holistically. And so I just want to raise people up. That's what religious people should be doing in this time of pandemic.
You know, there is a very beautiful verse in the Quran which says, "Laqad khalaqnal insana fi ahsani taqweem." We have created human beings in the best of character, in the best of molds. And I think that moments like this are moments which demand that we show the best side of ours as individuals, as leaders. And so therefore, I really want to thank you, Rabbi Michael Beals, for being a leader of your community, but not only that, but you're also a leader among the believing and faith-based communities in Delaware, and you're a leader for the rest of the state. So your message, I hope people are listening to it and they pay heed to your advice, your suggestions to how to make places of worship a partner in combating this crisis. I hope leaders in different communities also take it to heart and act upon it. So I want to thank you again for taking time out for talking to me.
Shukran. I love you. I thank you for your work. May we go from strength to strength. And as you're having these wonderful conversations across the spectral realm, the spiritual realm, I'm hoping that you will create a new reality so that when we're on the other side of the pandemic, we'll find other ways of working together as well. But this should be Breshit, the beginning of a new cooperation and partnership. Out of bad can come good. And you're proving this by these discussions, these Khanversations.
Khanversations, yes. And I want to wish our viewers happy Passover and happy Easter. Thank you.
Happy Ramadan for you.
Yes.
Ramadan Baruch, it should be blessed.
Inshallah, it's coming, inshallah.